It's Exodus summary day today, so each of the individual parts of the story are now completed, and now it's just broad thoughts on the overall bigger picture of it. Again, as with Genesis, it was, if I'd sat down to read it in one go, I think I would have really struggled with it, because it's just a slightly odd story where some weird stuff happens and then some really boring rules come along at the end. And again, it's written in that same tone as Genesis in terms of the slightly stodgy, matter-of-fact, almost cold writing style, which I guess makes sense given that it's supposedly written by Moses, as was Genesis, so it's him still writing it, we believe. As a very basic summing up of the Bible so far, you might say we've got Genesis, which is just a story about how problematic human beings are, but necessarily so, as we've seen in the summary in episode 12 from that. Then Exodus is a story about just a bunch of people leaving an area, but it's obviously just a stage in which God can showcase some evidence of his existence and makes clear what he is expecting of us. In that respect, I think it is again a really clever bit of writing, but it's so difficult to pick up on that because you can really lose some meaningful stuff in the weirdness. So breaking it down into those smaller chunks is, I think, I found very useful. There are nonetheless some elephants in the room to deal with again, and actually I think possibly even more problematic elephants in the room than they were with Genesis, because in that case at least it seemed fairly clear that they were dealing with some metaphorical things. But in Exodus it seems to be claimed broadly, the plagues actually happened. So we've got some sort of pretty big scale magic stuff going on that we're going to have to figure out what to do with. The videos have actually sparked some very interesting debates. Not necessarily always in the comments. It's been my uncle and a friend have both emailed me with some interesting naturalistic theories that might explain different parts of what's going on in the story. As a couple of examples, one of them is this idea that the burning bush that spoke to Moses. There's a theory going around, I gather, that it could have been some sort of hallucinogenic bush, as in once it's burned and you inhale the fumes from it. It's a hallucinogen, and then Moses is obviously off with the fairies and talking about God talking to him and all the rest of it. There's also the explosion of Santorini, which is interesting and seems to be pretty well placed relative to Egypt to account for some of the potential accounts of the plagues. Things like a cloud in the day and a fire by the night, and then there's a tsunami could explain potentially the Red Sea, and the sun disappearing for 4 days in terms of volcanic ash and all the rest of it. I believe the dates of the Santorini explosion don't quite match up, but then this isn't a particularly accurate science, so it's worth taking reasonably seriously, I think. Except I think the more important question perhaps that it begs is, does it actually matter? By that I mean that if you're God, it's difficult to call using natural mechanics as cheating. So volcanoes accounting for plagues, bushes that get you high accounting for odd conversations that don't make a lot of sense, or even a meteor shower landing on Sodom and Gomorrah. It obviously would be a problem if some awfully clever writer of the day had heard about all these events and then cobbled together some fictional narrative to link them all up together. We certainly can't say that that's not possible. On the assumption that Moses did actually write the book of Exodus, which I don't think is particularly disputed that he wrote it, which whether it's true or not is another matter, but whether he wrote it I think is broadly agreed. There's the possibility that he was just up to something and trying to manipulate people in some way or another, or he was high as a kite off this bush that was on fire and he thought God spoke to him. But it's not like thus far Moses is having a particularly good time, so if it's a scam, it's probably the worst scam in history. And if he was hallucinating from the smoke from the bush, that doesn't really explain everything that happened for the next 40 years. So I think we do need to treat this stuff with a few principles going forward in terms of what's reasonable to have as a starting point. For one, we obviously need to accept that this could just be a guy recording history. It may all be absolutely true. I think if we don't have an open mind as to that, then there's not much point asking this question and watching these videos or recording it. We've got to have some sort of open mind about that. There's also the question of, if we're going to just disregard what someone said happened, then we can't selectively disregard history. So a few hundred years after what we're looking at here, Socrates was walking around, and whilst you can find a statue of Socrates and all that sort of thing, I don't know if that was built at the time or anything, but if you see what I mean in terms of these things aren't very far apart in history, so you can't just selectively say, no, this one doesn't fit something, so we're going to get rid of it, and this one does make sense, so we're going to keep it. I think we've got to allow for the possibility that it is all reasonably accurate accounting. I think also we can't rely on any one piece of the Bible in isolation to be any sort of proof for the existence of God. Not least, of course, we've also got the problem of translation, in terms of this stuff has come down thousands of years, been translated lots of times. And I have to say, I don't expect for 1 minute that this is actually going to be a puzzle that can be solved in terms of proof, which is extremely disappointing. I think what we're looking at more is a beyond reasonable doubt weight of evidence sort of thing. Do things stack up or not? So if the plagues did have a naturalistic explanation, the existence or not of God does not need to hinge entirely on that. Overall, therefore, I think it's the big picture across the whole span of the Bible that's actually going to make or fail to make the case for an existence of God. This is a big part of why I didn't veer off into naturalistic theories in the story videos, because we just can't prove anyway if these events even happened, let alone whether God waved a magic wand to make it happen. And I don't think it matters whether God used a volcano to create the plagues or just magicked them out of thin air any more than I think it matters that half of the book of Genesis is evidently, to me, metaphorical, or at least significantly exaggerated in some of it. I'm aware that's getting close to a cop-out. After all, what kind of trial, for want of a better word, ignores whether supernatural events were actually supernatural or not? But the point is that we can never know the answer to that question anyway. So I think the question of whether it matters, whether it was naturalistic or not, is a better question to be asking and a more productive use of our time. My feeling is that in the context of a short story about the plagues, yeah, it looks like it matters whether those plagues were actually created by God or the result of a volcano. But I suspect that it won't matter in the grand scheme over the whole Bible. That being said, I appreciate if it was actually a supernatural event, then that's very important, and that would, well, basically prove the existence of God. But we don't get to know that either way. That's just not something we can prove, or anyone can prove or disprove either way. So there's not a great deal of point, I think, in particularly dwelling on it. Regardless of whether the plagues were caused by natural or supernatural mechanisms, the plague being sold as an act of God seems to offer some sort of partial explanation as to why we don't get to see much evidence for the existence of God these days. The part in the story where God hardens the Pharaoh's heart in order to be able to unleash more of the plague seems to be a mechanism by which the event has been made much larger. Because it appeared in the story that about 4 times the Pharaoh tried to back out, then God hardens his heart so that things keep going. And to be fair, when Moses and Aaron walk in with a stick that turns into a snake, granted the sorcerers did it with the round the back trick perhaps, you think at that point you've got, okay, no, fine, have them back. I don't like the Israelites anyway, or Hebrews as they were calling them then. Off you go, just take them away. But he didn't. So it does seem that the story is about God showcasing his power as evidence for his existence, and that's supposed to be a legacy that's then passed down. And of course, now 3,000 years later, we are still talking about it. So if the story of Exodus is true, then that was, well done. You've nailed what you set out to do there. Between that evidence of God's existence and God making the point that he is the boss, that would seem to be broadly the point of the story of Exodus, which it achieves very well, I think. There's an odd aspect to the story in that the people are always in search of other gods, even to the extent of this silly golden calf made from their own jewellery right in front of their faces, so they're clearly aware it is not a god. And that perhaps ties back to the idea of social maturity. I suppose it's easy to dismiss because back in the Dark Ages they didn't really know how anything worked, so it would logically make sense, I suppose, potentially, just to say, oh yes, some sort of god did it, so they might always be in search of that. But even in today's context, you've got somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world believing God, or at least the God who is the God of Abraham. So it would be fair to say that even now, within humans, there seems to be a draw towards some sort of looking for a divine element to life. And perhaps in modern terms, that's even more significant because we know a lot more stuff about, we know how old the universe is, we know how it got started, and we know that the Earth isn't flat anymore. So it does make you wonder, might a creator have baked into human subconsciousness a bit of a predisposition to look for the divine. Of course, if that's the case, then there's an argument that it's backfired absolutely horribly, because every 5 minutes God is having to worry about people wandering off to other random gods and cattle, as it happens. And even the three main religions that all believe in that same God, being the God of Abraham, can't agree what he actually wants from them all. But it does seem there is a case to make that potentially there's something ingrained in humanity to look for that sort of thing. I think for me personally, the seemingly instinctive draw to a belief in a divine is one of the key hurdles to belief in God, because it feels a little bit like, I'm going to be careful how I say this, feels a little bit like neurosis, like an inability to cope emotionally with the possibility that life is just random, cruel, fleeting and doesn't actually matter. I must stress that is absolutely not intended as judgment or to offend anyone, although probably if you're easily offended, this is not a good channel to be watching. And part of the reason that I'm agnostic rather than atheist is because I don't feel that life is just random, cruel, fleeting and doesn't matter. But it doesn't really make much logical sense to me that I feel that way in the absence of a bigger picture. I think that's one of the big problems with atheism, isn't it? There are some big problems in arguing for meaning and morality without borrowing concepts from theology. And I don't think atheists are necessarily aware that that's what they're doing. But I'm aware there are counter arguments to that. But for me, it just seems that it's difficult to make the argument for morality and meaning in the absence of that. It's a question I think you've got to tackle. I suppose in that respect it's a bit of a paradox, simultaneously feeling inexplicably that life is meaningful, but then also feeling that to ascribe meaning to life has a whiff of wishful thinking about it. Anyway, it's worth briefly touching on the idea that nothing ever seems to be given for free in the Bible. A good example of that is where the Israelites are fighting the Amalekites and Moses has to keep his arms up in the air the whole time. And he's pushing 80 at this point, so I mean they're blocking him up with rocks and all the rest of it. But why would God not just protect the Israelites as the righteous bunch versus the Amalekites who have just come along and just had a pop at them? I do wonder if possibly this alludes to an interesting part in human nature that I believe is scientifically measured and all the rest of it. And because it seems clear that for humans to gain rewards without having earned them is just not good for us at all. That idea that we basically rot if we don't move forward, grow and earn that growth. So God asking for some sort of arbitrary act in order to gain some sort of miracle, so you hold up your staff to make the sea go, or whack a rock to get water to come out, or hold your arms up to win a battle, or throw a log into water to get rid of the bitterness. There's always something you have to do, and that seems to sort of tie up sensibly with some reasonable principles of life that we are aware of that are absolute and accurate. But handily, God has been very chatty in Exodus, so we have a useful summary of some bits that we can take from Exodus to add to the framework we started building in Genesis about what life is about and what God wants. Saying that, I'm going to start with the negative one, in that it's still not clear what the reward is for doing what we're told. This is partly because God hasn't actually said that yet, but also partly because no one's actually doing as they're told, apart from maybe Moses. And to be fair, he's not having a particularly fun time of it, really, is he? So that's still a big question for us to find out going forward. But at least now we are clear on what we are supposed to be doing. And God has set down some rules now, so it's the benchmark for what good behaviour is now clear. What we should be doing in terms of those rules, it seems pretty reasonable to me. You can get lost behind all the pomp and ceremony and the weird things about donkeys and falling down holes and all the rest of it. But the underlying principle that runs through it all is basically the idea of don't be punks and be excellent to each other, which I think is that's quite reasonable basis for running a society, isn't it? So apparently impossible, but it's a good aim, certainly. God also clearly wants to be acknowledged and is willing to provide evidence of his existence for those purposes, but is not going to provide proof. That is obviously extremely inconvenient, this lack of proof, but if you see the episode 12, the Genesis summary, putting that why I think that makes perfect sense that God would only provide evidence rather than proof. But yeah, I think the Book of Exodus was brilliant and a very worthy sequel to Genesis, and that they've both done very distinct things and moved things forward. So we've picked up quite a lot from this as an addition to what we picked up from Genesis. I would struggle to. I called a moderate negative on Genesis in terms of being metaphorical without making that clear. I don't think I actually have anything similar on that for Exodus. I think it's just a great bit of writing, useful context, and all the rest of it. And I think largely the rest of the story is broadly frills and a bit of that time, so things should evolve hopefully over the rest of the Bible. But next we're on to the book of Leviticus. We're starting with the initial problem that we've got to figure out what that word even means.